So welcome everybody to our second knowledge session on climate issues. Today we'll be talking about climate intersections and for organizations to learn about how can their cause or their mission can have an impact on climate action efforts. This is not a straightforward climate action event, but an event on how can different organizations with different views, with different missions, such as education, health, nutrition, democracy, or social justice, can start having a climate action lens within their work. So I think it's going to be a very interesting session. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who is today with us, especially our two panelists, Johannes Lunderhausen from Active Philanthropy and Fabia Göring from Bosch Stiftung. Active Philanthropy is an active member of Latimpacto, and Bosch Stiftung is one of our founders who believe in Latimpacto since day one, and we are truly grateful for this. Before we start today's session, I just wanted to invite you to our conference that will take place next month between April 24th and 27th. All Latimpacto members and the impact community at large of Latin America and the world will be meeting at Cartagena, Colombia, for our conference Impact Minds Standing Together. You can see here our URL to find your tickets, to gain more information about the speakers, the conference, the venue, and all the activities that we will be having. It's going to be a very experiential event. It's going to be a place where you can start renewing your social skills that some of us lost due to the COVID, to the pandemic, and meet, of course, people who you haven't had the possibility of meeting, and reconnect as well with peers that you haven't been able to meet for the last 2 years. We have really interesting guests and attendees, such as Ricardo Sierra from Celsia, Sandra Breca from Bosch Stiftung, María Ángeles León, Paula Moreno, Larry Sachs, Margarita Albors, Chris West, and Catalina Garcia. They come from different sectors, corporates, grant-making foundations, also as well consultancies, international cooperation. So it's going to be a very diverse and interesting opportunity. Hopefully you can meet us. Please reach out to us if you have any question about attending, and we'll be more than happy to assist you out. So now that I've given that announcement, we can start as well with more information about our webinar today. So as I mentioned, we're going to have two amazing panelists today. Fabia Göring, she is the project manager of the migration program at Robert Bosch Stiftung. Fabia is in charge of the climate lens issues on migration, and she will greatly explain to us how migration and climate action intersect. And this is something that is very interesting for us as well, because as you might know, one of our impact communities as well is on migration. So it's very interesting as well to know how these two, for example, impact communities that Latimpacto is leading can have an intersection. And also we have Mr. Johannes Lunderhausen. Johannes has worked in different organizations, especially in the role of climate and sustainability, such as the GIZ, the Berlin Social Center, and today he is the climate knowledge lead of Active Philanthropy, and he's the one who has developed this idea of the climate intersection on different issues. So I think that is very interesting, and I will just give the voice to Johannes so we can start as well the webinar today. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Han. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so hello everybody. I hope you can see my screen and you can see and hear me. Unfortunately, I can't see you, but I'm sure we will have an interesting exchange later. What you can see here, of course, it's a landscape that might be much more familiar to many of you than it is to me. It's the Amazon rainforest. It's an ecosystem that has long been primed for being crucial in regulating the world's climate. And the reason for that, of course, is that the forests, the plants, and the soils in this forest store huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and therefore help to regulate climate change. But in 2021, Brazilian scientists found that the capacity of this forest to store carbon is actually diminishing. And it's diminishing to such an extent that this whole ecosystem might become a source of carbon emissions rather than an area where carbon is stored, therefore driving climate change rather than mitigating it. So my name is Johannes Lundeshausen of Active Philanthropy, and I'm very excited to speak to you today about climate intersections, especially as climate change, as this example of the Amazon shows, is a very, very urgent issue, an issue that needs to be addressed here and now. And I would like to show you today how you can get involved in tackling this challenge. Most of you participating today, Juan told me, are working at foundations, and as such, you're of course addressing many of the most crucial challenges that societies face today. So some of you might be protecting ecosystems like the Amazon, other ones might be trying to make the health system more resilient against pandemics, for example, or you might work on democracy. But the important point is that all of these issues and several others more can only be tackled and important social aims achieved if we also tackle climate change. I used to work in science, and scientists have been warning us of the consequences of climate change for many decades. But I have to say now that the times for predictions are more or less over. We see every day and all over the world that climate change is already happening. And that is why we don't just need scientists anymore, but we need everyone on board. We need every foundation, every philanthropist, every funder to integrate the fight against climate change and its consequences into their work. And I think that is why we are all here today. And this is something that we at Active Philanthropy want to help you to get on board of this fight. To do so, we work and we have developed this concept of climate intersections. So climate intersections are areas where established funding topics overlap with climate change. So it includes, for example, nature conservation, such as protecting the Amazon, for example, but it also includes other areas such as democracy, and this incorporates several subtopics such as the development of a carbon neutral but just and fair society, or the topic of migration that Fabia will talk about later. It also includes health, education, or how we deal with disadvantaged groups, but this is not an exclusive list. It could be continued in other areas. To spread awareness of these overlaps in principle, we have developed and published a report that's available on our website, which outlines in detail what the overlaps are. And maybe almost more importantly, it gives examples of foundations who are already working at these intersections. What's important here is that we want to show how climate change can be incorporated into your work without losing sight of the issue that is close to your heart, for example, health or education. Let me illustrate what this means by giving you two examples, namely health and the area of disadvantaged groups. So climate change and health, and I won't give you an outline of all the scientific stats and figures, but I'll give you a little bit of a story. Climate and health are inextricably linked, and a good example for that is air pollution. Fighting climate change and the fight against air pollution is almost synonymous. Why is that the case? The reason for that is that pollutants are often themselves greenhouse gases, or in other cases, they come from the same sources as greenhouse gases, such as cars. Just how damaging these emissions are for people's health is well, but sadly illustrated by the case of Ella Kissy Deborah. The girl grew up in an area of London, which is pictured here, where air pollution levels exceeded legal limits on a very regular basis. Ella suffered from breathing difficulties from an early age, and in 2013, she tragically died from an asthma attack. Meanwhile, a legal inquest has found that her death can be linked to air pollution in the city. Now, statistically, the relationship is very clear between premature death and air pollution, also in Latin America. In Latin America and in the Caribbean in 2019, 230,000 premature deaths were attributable also to air pollution. Especially in the times that we find ourselves in today, the COVID-19 pandemic, which doesn't quite seem over yet, focusing on air pollution becomes even more important. The Clean Air Fund, one of the case studies in our report, is an important organization leading on this topic. Another one is the German foundation Healthy Planet, Healthy People, and the foundation highlights that one of the best ways to encourage climate action is to focus on individual health benefits. What does it mean? It means that supporting measures such as air pollution control, but also others such as more healthy, maybe vegetable-based diets, doesn't just mitigate climate change, but it also promotes personal health. Now let's talk about disadvantaged groups. It's clear that climate change affects all of us, but it doesn't affect all of us equally. Hardest hit are clearly communities, but also individuals that belong to disadvantaged groups. That includes elderly people, it includes children, it includes people with disabilities, but it also includes women, such as Constance Ocolette, who's pictured here on this slide. Like millions of women worldwide, Constance is responsible for care work in her family, but also for agricultural labor and the collection of food. The impacts of climate change make all of these activities much more difficult. Constance could feel that for the first time in 2007, when several months of flooding wiped out her entire harvest. What's important here is that events such as floods for disadvantaged groups, they're not just temporary events that happen and then they are over, but these events really fortify their already existing exclusion in society. It's more difficult, for example, for women to gain further education or gain financial independence when they have to work harder, for example, to make up for a lost harvest. Meanwhile, Constance Ocolette has mobilized her community. They planted mango trees and avocado trees, which do not only provide valuable additional crops, but they also stabilize the soil and prevent soil erosion in the case of the next flood. What this example shows is that disadvantaged groups, although they are structurally disadvantaged, they can become agents of change also when they're facing climate change. But they do need support, and they do need support from funders. Several case studies in our report illustrate this, and one of them is the Edge Funders Alliance that underlines that disadvantaged groups need to be incorporated both in the planning of a project and the funding stream, but also in the implementation of these projects. And the reason is that only they know what really works efficiently on the ground. Now, this is the cover of our report. Responding to climate change, of course, is an enormous challenge. So we will have to adapt to a world that's warmer than ever before in the history of humans on this planet. And to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to decarbonize our economies, and we need to do so quickly, and we need to halve our emissions by 2030. Now, how can we tackle this challenge? I believe we can only tackle this challenge by working together. And for doing so, we cannot rely on foundations and funders that are specializing in climate change, for whom climate change is the main topic. But we need every funder, regardless of the initial mission, to get on board and to tackle climate change. Our report highlights that it's possible, and it showcases several case studies that show that and how this can be done. And you can find, as I said, the report on our website. So my main message really for the moment is that it doesn't really matter what area you are and have been engaged in. For each and every one of you, it's true that you can help to play an active part in shaping the future of our climate. So with this, I hand over to Fabia, who will speak in much more detail about the intersection between climate change and migration.
Yes, thank you very much, Johannes. And I quickly share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see it.
Yeah, perfectly.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Johannes, for this great insights and yeah, this amazing presentation, and also for Latimpacto and Active Philanthropy for organizing this webinar on such an important topic. So good morning, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Fabia Göring. I'm working in the Robert Bosch Foundation's migration team. So I'm really coming to this webinar from a migrations perspective. But as you can see, we're focusing in our work on the interlinkages between migration and climate change. So to start, I will say a few words on our foundation and how we came to work on this topic before I dig a bit more deeper into what these interlinkages are, how they look like, and how we work on these challenges. So the Robert Bosch Stiftung, a German foundation, is basically working on three big areas. First, education, health, and global issues. And in the education and in the health sector, we're focusing mainly on the German context. Also, we have our hospital, for example, in Stuttgart. So we're based in Stuttgart and in Berlin. Whereas in our global issues department, we work globally. And when I joined the foundation and three and a half years ago, we asked ourselves, what are actually the main challenges the world is facing today? So we really decided to undergo a huge strategic process and to focus our funding. We stopped 100% of our global international programs and just thought, okay, where can we best achieve impact? And we had several working groups, internal working groups, discussions with external experts, and we ended up with 6 topics you can see here. So this is our portfolio in the global issues department. It's peace, climate change, inequality, immigration society, migration, and democracy. And obviously, these topics as such are all huge challenges, but they're also all deeply interconnected. So for example, inequalities have an effect on democracy and maybe on the long term also on peace in our societies. Or climate change is affecting migration patterns, and international migration patterns are affecting immigration societies. So we really decided that our added value as a foundation is to work on exactly these interlinkages, to build bridges between the different sectors and to bring different people together. Yeah, but what does this mean more concretely for us in the migrations team? So I added here a quote from Ban Ki-moon, who said, "Migration is an expression of the human aspiration for dignity, safety, and a better future. It is part of the social fabric, part of our very makeup as a human family." And I think this quote illustrates quite well our mission or our vision of migration. So we see migration has always been part of human history. And we want to contribute to a far-sighted, inclusive migration policy, governance, and practice that respects human dignity, one of the core values of our founder, Robert Bosch. So when tackling migration issues, we don't see ourselves, for example, as a humanitarian actor or so. So we really decided to work on future challenges where we can add value. And we're working on 4 areas of engagement, which of course is human mobility in the context of climate change, but also the future of protection for refugees and migrants, new actors in migration governance, and technological change in migration. So I will now speak on human mobility in the context of climate change. And I will start with the broad question, how are these 2 big topics actually interconnected? What are the interlinkages between migration and climate change? And of course, this is a big question. And I just put here 5 key issues I think that are important to mention. So first of all, climate-induced disasters such as storms, droughts, and sea level rise affect people's livelihoods. So of course, climate change will lead to more and more extreme weathers, or more extreme weathers are already occurring. So there are sudden onset disasters such as storms but also slow onset disasters such as droughts and sea level rise that slowly impact people's livelihoods, and more people will not be able to stay and to maintain their lives in the places where they live. Secondly, which is most important for us as a migrations team, is to keep in mind that most people wish to stay. So in-place adaptation and resilience building are key. People often don't want to leave their homes, but migration can be a way to adapt to changing climate. So when the situation is really changing in the area where people live, it can also be a way to improve livelihoods. Thirdly, when people move, most people migrate internally within the borders of their countries. So this is important to mention because we often hear in the media of like climate refugees and huge waves of refugees coming to the US or Europe just as a threatening scenario. And actually, climate-induced migration is mostly internal migration. People migrate within their cultural areas, within their patterns of what they actually know. So this is something we really have to keep in mind also when trying to improve migration policies at an international level, which often target international migration, cross-border migration, and not really internal migration, where there needs to be a more strengthened approach. Fourthly, to adequately respond to rising challenges within their specific local context, inclusive, people-centered approaches need to be developed. So the effects of climate change on livelihoods are extremely local, and it's really important to include the people who are actually concerned within the planning of projects and in the finding of solutions, in the development of solutions. And last but not least, one key issue is that people often migrate from rural areas to cities because, of course, when your life depends on agriculture, those are the people who first notice the consequences of a changing climate. So in this context, cities are confronted with a twofold challenge. On the one side, the integration of new citizens, with people coming from rural areas trying to make a new life in cities. But often they have different skills coming from a rural context and now are in cities. So really, cities need to prepare for this, but also cities themselves are affected by the consequences of climate change, which is, for example, a huge challenge for coastal cities. And on this, I want to mention 2 specific groups also, because we also have to keep in mind that with changing climate, many people are not able to move. So we're talking in this context about trapped populations, when actually the situation is getting worse and worse and people don't have the means to look for a new life. So those are really the most vulnerable, which we also have to keep in mind. And another important and quite illustrative example are the small island states. So whole nations who are affected by a rising sea level and who have to look for new territories, but where a whole nation is affected. So this is quite, a big challenge we also have to tackle. Okay, this is just a brief basis on how migration and climate change are interconnected. But what needs to be done, or what can we do? And I think one approach, obviously, is to tackle climate change and to approach it from this issue. But also the migration lens is a very important approach, and also to bring together both areas. So our work as a foundation on human mobility in the context of climate change is based on a threefold approach: applied research, local innovations, and cross-sectoral and interregional dialogue. And in all this, we're focusing on the African continent, because we decided when we started with this focus that we really have to see where we can have an impact, and that Africa is extremely vulnerable in this context. So all our local funded projects are on the African continent, but we also have some global projects looking at this from a more broader lens. Okay, but what are we actually doing? So we started with applied research to just also build our own knowledge base. It's extremely important to really know what you're talking about and to set your own projects on a good basis. So we funded, for example, our first partners, I think, were the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC in Geneva, because as I said, it's mostly a challenge of internal migration. So we said that's a very important lens, and they developed an analytical framework on the different effects of climate change on populations and on how to tackle them. And they're currently looking at best practice or good practice examples from around the world who are actually already tackling these challenges, and they're preparing an interactive online tool so that you can really distill like lessons learned on how to best set up projects, what's already there, and what are good ways to go. Because many people, when you look at the research, that's an extremely important field, but it's also the field in this context where there's also already quite an awareness. So from a scientific challenge, it's clear that things need to change, but many partners ask us, what can we actually do on the ground? So we always have this approach of applied research. We also, for example, funded a project by the Earth Institute at Columbia University, who did a modeling with different scenarios for 2030, 2040, and 2050, looking at the African continent with a heat map, looking, okay, who is going to, like which regions are going to be most affected by climate change, and then overlapping with a conflict dimension, but also population growth dimensions, and looking, okay, in which areas is outward migration and inward migration, to really understand what we're talking about and which are the most affected regions. But as I said, academic research is very important, but things need to happen on the ground. So we started to look into local projects that we could fund, and we developed together with the Mayors Migration Council, a global convening of mayors, a project which is called the Global Cities Fund for Inclusive Climate Action. So also there, we're for now focusing on the African continent, but we're currently looking into applications of African cities and their proposals on what could be done in their cities to tackle the challenges they have on the ground. And then, just to mention one practical project we're funding, and at the third level, for cross-sectoral and interregional dialogue, we tried to bring this knowledge base that we developed on to an upper and also political level. So for example, with the project we funded at Columbia University, all this fed into the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. So we started in December. The initiative is an initiative by UNDP, the World Bank, and the African Union Commission, and we supported, and they had, based on this quantitative research and also complemented by qualitative research at a household level, they looked together with a broad range of stakeholders, they discussed the research findings, looking with practitioners, academics, but also politicians, and how we could transform this into action. So we're now working on policy recommendations that we then want to transform into an agenda for action to really look what's needed on the African continent and how can we join efforts to really work on these topics. Yeah, that's a short overview of some of the projects we fund in this area. And I hope it also became clear maybe on how we approach this quite challenging and complex issue as a foundation. Yeah, and I want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fabia, thank you very much. It is really interesting what you just shared with us and Johannes as well. There are a lot of similarities that we've found within our own research and our own work, both in climate action and migration. One of the most interesting things, for example, is how there is an important need to start funding more strategically and more efficiently adaptation initiatives. And that is very important because what we found on the climate action report that we're going to launch during our conference is that not a lot of money is going toward adaptation measures in Latin America. As you mentioned, a lot of people want to stay in their own villages, in their own towns, working what they've been doing their whole lives. And if we don't address these adaptations, this resilience building, it will be very difficult for people to stay with their local livelihood and the livelihood they've had for a long time. And that is very interesting to see how we can make it more strategically, and we can start making international funders and Latin American funders start thinking more on how can they deploy more capital towards adaptation measures. One of the things we said is like there's this unbalanced relation between climate mitigation projects and climate adaptation projects. A lot of money is flowing to climate mitigation projects because, of course, it has more like a ring to it somehow. But it is quite important as well on how can we develop climate adaptation projects in the most vulnerable communities. The second thing is, I think, with what Johannes and what Fabia have mentioned, is that we pretty much can see a little bit of a domino effect when it comes to climate action and migration. Climate change, for example, affects disproportionately vulnerable people at the forefront of nature, which mostly have rural livelihoods. This, of course, this climate change forces them to migrate. For example, in the case of the Northern Triangle, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, these huge hurricanes are destroying the coastal communities, forcing people to move towards the cities or to move towards the inland. And what happens as well there, of course, the cities have more pressure on their social service they provide. The people, of course, moving there have a worse quality of life because they're vulnerable. They are low-income people, so they have to move either to the slums or to the unofficial neighborhoods. So, of course, this worsens their quality of life. And more importantly as well, these people will get to the cities having skills that people in the cities don't look for example, fisheries or stuff like this. And the rural knowledge becomes somehow obsolete. And of course, this creates for unemployment to grow and inequality as well to increase. So it is important to see how climate action can have a domino effect in the different issues that organizations are tackling. And that is something very interesting. Just to close as well our participation and to open discussion, I would like to invite as well Johannes to give us like our next steps on what you should do in case you're interested in aligning your vision, your mission with climate action.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. You've already spoken about funding strategically, and of course, Fabia showed how well that can work once you've undergone kind of strategic development process at your organization. But what we find at Active Philanthropy, at least with the people that we work with, is that many foundations aren't quite there yet, right? So they haven't undergone an internal restructuring process to incorporate climate change, but there's still an urge to take this issue on. And then the question always comes up, okay, what tools exist and what can be the steps for me as a newcomer. And I would just briefly like to talk about this for a moment without going into a specific intersection. So there's some general recommendations that we give out to our partners here at Active Philanthropy. And what's important is that there are 4 important fields in your foundation that you can work on. One is developing knowledge. So it essentially includes building climate expertise. So you really understand the issue. For example, develop some deeper knowledge on climate change and migration, what Fabio talked about, and then also to understand the options that you have. There's also then, of course, a question of how do you deal with that in your funding. You can fund climate change directly, mitigation or adaptation, as Juan mentioned, or you can look at the co-benefits, working more at these intersections between the issues that have been close to your heart for a long time and climate change. Then a very important part in terms of finances is looking at your assets to ensure that the way that your endowment is invested is not harmful to climate and is not driving climate change. And there is then also, last but not least, an issue of governance to look at the decisions that are being taken, for example, at board level in your organization, and enable them to be climate friendly. Now, all of these things are important. The area of intersections that I talked about is kind of somewhere between developing knowledge, putting a climate lens on your core mission, and funding work with climate co-benefits. What all of these areas have in common though, and this is something I want to focus on briefly, is that all of them rely on and are made really much more easier by the involvement and support of other people in your organization, of other members of staff, of trustees, but also of your grantees. So what I want to emphasize in terms of taking next steps is really to build a momentum within, the wider universe that is your organization. And this is crucial also to be successful in incorporating climate change. We need to remember that you and your colleagues at your organization, you're really the experts of your day-to-day work. You know best and you're best placed to decide where change will be most effective. So let me just speak about 4 areas, 4 steps that you can take. One is obviously related to the point of knowledge. One is climate training. So providing training or maybe taking training that will help you understand the issues and then develop a baseline for further decisions. The next one, the next step you could take is sharing ideas within your organization. So that is really to set up regular team workshops, maybe lunchtime presentations, for people to learn more about this issue, but also to exchange experience of how they are dealing with climate change in their everyday work. One step further removed would be to set up green teams or climate teams, whatever you want to call them. And they provide really hubs for people to connect, hubs for people who want to influence the wider organization and who want to drive this issue forward. They create, in some sense, also accountability, because they are contact points for people elsewhere in the organizations who aren't quite so involved in this issue. And last but not least, the issue of creating climate metrics. So here I would say you can speak to your manager about incorporating climate metrics into your individual or your team targets, or even if you are a senior member of staff or you're managing teams, you can work with those teams to develop these targets and provide support to meet the targets in everyday work. And this is really a key aspect in terms of centering climate action in your team's work. Let me focus a little bit more on this issue of climate training by giving you an example of one of the tools that are out there. And it's a tool that we have developed. It's an online course, a self-paced online course called Climate and Philanthropy, the Learning Journey. And we've created it to really educate funders about their potential roles in climate philanthropy. So this micro-learning course is specifically designed for foundation staff, and it really allows them to learn about climate change, its dynamics, the causes, the consequences, but to also start thinking about individual, the development of individual funding strategies. So it's a compact course, although it's in depth, it's guided, and it has visually engaging materials in it. It's very much video focused, and it consists of 8 modules that last about an hour and a half each, which you can do at your own pace, but also several peer exchange workshops of an hour and a half. And we've included this because we know just how important it is for many people to connect to like-minded peers and to learn from each other. There are many speakers in there from the Clean Air Fund, the Children's Investment Fund, the London School of Economics, who share the experience they had with incorporating climate change, but also their specific knowledge about climate change and climate philanthropy with you in this course. This is a screenshot of what it looks like, but what's important is that the aim of this is to educate and empower philanthropy experts who aren't climate philanthropy experts yet. And it's really to increase your confidence on the topic and to identify in more detail than we can do it now in this webinar, identify next steps, and to also, last but not least, network with peers, build a network that you can then draw on to further drive change in your organization. And with that little example, I think I conclude this and thank Latin Impacto very much for organizing this. We work a lot in Europe, and we're always happy when we can share our experience and learn about the experience in other continents from funders, in this case in Latin America. So thank you, Juan. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Johannes. And we're very happy that we and Latin Impacto can start building bridges between Latin America and other regions. Of course, Europe is one of the most important. And if you're as well interested in coming to learn more about the Latin American landscape, the context, especially regarding conservation and climate action, we're going to have this very interesting study trip to the Amazon in October. So we'll be sending out more details soon. Moreover, I would like to open the floor to any questions on or comments. For example, if your organization is as well working on climate action or on another issue, or if you have any questions to Fabia or Johannes, do write in the Q&A box, in the chat box, or raise your hand. You're more than welcome to it. Oh, well, one of the interesting things I would like to invite is I see Alice is here from Wings, and Wings is as well promoting a very interesting way to bring a lot of foundations closer to climate. So Alice, I would like to invite you to mention a little bit about the Climate Action Task Force the Wings is currently leading, and we are very happy to be participating in.
Hello, Juan. I'm sorry I was late to join. That's why I couldn't. I was quiet here. Thanks very much for the invitation, and congratulations actually to the Active Philanthropy for a wonderful presentation. I'm really excited to learn more about the training experience and so just a very brief comment on Wings. We are launching the implementation guide of the International Philanthropy Commitment for Climate very soon. And after that, we will actually host a series of webinars talking about each of the pillars of the implementation guide, and of course, each of the pillars that are related to the commitment implementation. So for instance, training and educating your boards and staff members is, as Johannes was mentioning right now, is precisely the first one. So we see that there is a lot of interest and demand of content and where to start on this, which is something that's maybe sound very easy, but it's apparently not as much, especially for non-climate philanthropies. So yeah, and we are planning a lot of discussions, events, and opportunities for peer learning throughout this year and the years to come. So yeah, that's it for me for now, but I'm actually very curious to see the questions and comments from the audience as well. And once again, congratulations, Juan, for the excellent event.
Thank you very much, Alice. Well, I actually have one question to Fabia, and it regards on how has Bosch Foundation acted as a thought leader to influence other foundations or other partners to become more aware of the role they have in climate action.
Yes, well, I think today's session is a first step towards this. Thank you, Juan, of course, for organizing this. And I think that's definitely one important step, is to share our experiences and also our challenges we had on how we tackled this. And I think just to make this clear, I think it's not necessary to have a huge strategic process to integrate this climate lens into your work. Obviously, this can also be done step by step, incrementally. Yeah, what we are also very much looking forward to is, like, every time we build up a project, in the project design, obviously we try to be as inclusive as possible to integrate the target group, but also to make this a project where other funders can join. So to establish structures where others can come on board. We did this, for example, with the Global Cities Fund for Inclusive Climate Action, where we worked together with the MMC and C40 and said, okay, we're going to fund 5 first cities and we're going to focus on the African continent. But of course, all other funders who are interested in the topic are welcome to come on board and to support this, maybe also with another focus. And yeah, we're doing this in several projects, like to see, okay, who could actually be interested and what also other funders have as their contributions on how to set up projects. So we always look into, okay, the more corporations we have and the more partners, the more different ideas and aspects come on board, and the more innovative and complete a project can be, so to say. So I think that's also an important part of how we work, actually.
Thank you very much, Fabia. I have one question here. I think it's addressed to Johannes. It says, climate change adaptation or mitigation requires some level of expertise, which can take up time and costs to incorporate this expertise into the organization. Do you recommend assigning budgets to fast track this integration, or are there any other strategies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, it's something that we always hear, and it's obviously an important question for foundations, especially ones that aren't really big, like, for example, the Bosch Foundation. How are we going to learn about it, and how are we going to pay for it? And what I would say is, it's of course good if you have the luxury of assigning additional resources, to assign them early on in your journey, because that will help to speed up the process of incorporating climate change. But I would also say it is not strictly necessary. That's exactly our point, I think, of intersections. It is totally reasonable to incorporate climate change in your existing work. So you don't need to set aside a budget for climate change if you're working, for example, on women's rights, because without tackling climate change, you can't really, looking into the future, address women's rights. So you might well use the budget that's already there. And the first step that I spoke to is obviously the issue of training and learning. That doesn't need to cost much. many foundations have a training budget for their staff, for their senior staff, for their junior staff, and that can easily be used to upskill yourself quite quickly on climate change, and then you can take the next steps, which will be more informed from that.
Javier, you have your hand up.
Yeah, maybe I can also respond to this from and contribute with our approach.
Great.
So I think, as I outlined before, for us, our first steps was also to fund research projects, because this allowed us really to learn on the topic. So there we really had the role of a funder, and we learned from the expertise of our partners. And I think this is something which is also extremely important to accept as a foundation, that there are so many experts out there, and they have great ideas, and they need your support, and they're happy to exchange. So I really realized, specifically in this field, that it's quite a new and emergent field. So I had many great discussions, and foundations were always very welcome in the rounds, in the expert discussions, to also learn on what's actually going on and what are the challenges. So it's learning by funding, maybe also to a certain extent, and then to develop and reshape your strategy. Yeah, I think that's an important approach.
Yeah, thank you, Fabio. I totally agree with that, and I think it relates to grants, not just to grants that are focusing on research, but generally. So this fear of waiting to learn more before we can start to work on climate change doesn't really work, because we don't have much time left, and there will always be a degree of uncertainty regarding this global issue. So starting with grants that help you to explore this, and being open to learning, and learning from the things that do work, but also learning from the things that don't work, I think is really a brave but important approach to take as we are going into this decade.
And also, when you come from a different angle, like us from a migrations angle, it's great for climate people, for example, to also learn from us. So people bring different kinds of expertise to the table, and I think we should always see this, to have a project with different partners and to see each other's expertise, and you don't have to have the entire climate change expertise to integrate this into your work.
Those are really great insights, Fabia and Johannes. I just had a question for Johannes. For example, all the project and what you've designed is aimed towards funders, but what would be your recommendation to other types of actors, such as impact investors or corporates, who have probably like a different vision from funders? Do you think they can use the program, the material you've created, or would you advise for them to complement it as well with some different thoughts or projects?
I should say, of course, that the climate space is, quickly growing. I mean, it is a big movement, and we're seeing increasing action, and that's obviously a very good thing. We're not there yet, as we all know, but there are more and more people getting behind the climate agenda. So what that means is that there's also more diversification. And I think if you're starting out, in many cases, if you're not a funder, you will still benefit from looking at the things that we have produced. For example, beyond the learning journey that I presented on, we developed a climate mitigation tool that's an interactive gamified tool online, where you can quickly click yourself through solutions in climate mitigation. And that's, initially it's applicable to everyone interested in that space. But the deeper you go in, I think you might want to look to other actors. If you, for example, are businesses are often mainly interested in cutting emissions from their operations. And that's an issue that is of interest to foundations too, but it's not the main concern. The main concern of foundations is changing their funding strategies, and it should also be looking at the endowment and how it is invested to create financial return. So yes and no. I think people who are starting out, they can also look at our materials, but there are more specialized providers, for example, looking at operations of businesses down the supply chain than we are.
So I have another question. Besides, well, it's for you, Johannes. Besides the tool you have just mentioned, which specific activities and narratives have prompted philanthropists to shift meaningful money from traditional investments to climate change mitigation activities?
Mm-hmm. I think it's also a question to Fabia, because obviously it's something that she has experienced firsthand in the Bosch Foundation. I have to say, in terms of the specificity of narratives, it depends, because this is really the message I want to get across. There is always an intersection between your work and climate change. So what has shifted people's minds is when it's close to what they've worked on before. So obviously then the narrative is different if you're working on migration than it is when you're working on children, for example. And one of our main supporters, CIF, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, they worked on children, on nutrition, on children's rights and education for a very long time, and dedicated substantial resources to it. And then they found there's no point in continuing that if we don't also incorporate climate change, because we might build a school, educate new teachers in sub-Saharan Africa, but if the road is flooded because of sea level rise, children won't be able to get there. If they're ill because of malaria, they also won't be able to go to school, even if the school is very well equipped. So narratives that are close to people's hearts, close to the issue that they've been working on for a long time, are the ones that really shift the agenda of organizations.
Oh yeah, do you want to have a word?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think for climate change, it's such a big and obvious challenge that for many organizations, at least from our perspective, I think, or from my experience, a lot of employees also saw how important this topic is, and we started to build all the knowledge. So we started from scratch, I would say, or from quite low level, and really tried to build up our knowledge on this. And we really quickly saw that climate change mitigation, as it said here, it's not all what we're talking about. So we decided that climate change is one of the areas we're working in, but also that it's really important to feed in and to work on the intersections. So this is also not shifting money away from other topics, but having this climate lens in all the topics. So I think this is also important to mention also internally, that you can just integrate this as you do with many other topics like women's rights or so. Build this into your existing strategies.
That's great as well. We have another current affairs question. So now that we live in this situation as well in Eastern Europe, how are organizations such as Bosch Stiftung reacting to the issues of climate and migration? Is there a rapid response, or have you activated an emergency plan?
Well, as I think I tried to briefly touch on this before, so we don't see ourselves as an emergency organization or humanitarian actor. I think there we have states who can react quickly, or other actors who really specify on this. But we see ourselves as working on future issues, and that's also why we really focus on human mobility in the context of climate change, because we see that this in the migration space is something that very few organizations work on. So most organizations, obviously, now when things happen like in Afghanistan or in Ukraine, of course, there's a sudden need, but we try to build up and to prepare for future challenges. Of course, like in this case of Ukraine, we also then have a certain, part of our work contributed directly to this. So we spoke with all the partners we funded previously in Ukraine, and we gave additional grants now to react to this, but we continue working on these longer term challenges.
That's amazing, and it's really interesting to know how you're supporting the needs of people who are the victims of what's happening today in Eastern Europe. And finally, I have the one final question that can be answered as well by Fabia and by Johannes. In your view, how much of these intersections are integrated or considered in global development initiatives, such as the 30 by 30 goals or the SDGs? Do you see, for example, that the SDGs are contemplating the important role of intersection?
Because I should just start briefly. It's a very good question. It's also two very good examples, because so the 30 by 30 initiative is kind of quintessentially focusing on the intersection between climate and nature conservation. So there you kind of are not really considering the breadth of intersections, but it is one important intersection that it is focusing on. With the SDGs, it's the opposite. It's really considering the breadth of interactions between all development goals that have been discussed on a global stage. I think it's a very useful framework because it manages to get a lot of people on board of this wider sustainability agenda, and it's obviously gained a lot of momentum over the years. I've also known many people, though, who have been a bit careful to adopt it because it is very complex. I mean, because there's so many intersections, if you like, presented in this framework, and people kind of back away a little bit and say, okay, well, this is a little bit too much. But what you can take from it, I think, is to single out a couple of these goals and then see how do they come together and how do they intersect. And there are analyses out there that show how individual ones connect. Maybe Papa, you can say more about this.
Yes, thank you, Johannes. And I think this was already a very good answer. I think the SDGs are quite broad. So I would say to achieve the goals of the SDGs is obviously very important to work on these interlinkages. But as you said, it's so broad that it's kind of difficult to handle, as like a lot of interlinkages are there. In our work, we also look at all the migration and climate change frameworks that are currently developed or existing. And for example, with the Global Compact on Migration and the International Migration Review Forum, so the first review of what has been achieved since the Global Compact, we have like climate change mentioned very briefly I think in section 2. But of course, we are trying to really look at what does this mean and how can we work on this. So for us, that's one important point. We also went to COP and will join COP this year to bring this migration expertise to the international climate change discussions. So to really bring awareness on both sides to work on these challenges.
Yeah, I think that is really important as well for that organizations that have an understanding of one issue and on climate action participate in both forums, because of course people working in education, in health, in migration can provide those working in climate change issues a very interesting viewpoints that might not be considered or can go under the radar, and that is something really interesting. And as well for organizations working migration, such as for example in the Migration Compact, as you mentioned, having this vision of how climate action climate change can affect migrants and their security and the root causes of migration is also very interesting as well to know, and it's something that needs to be considered by those policymakers and funders working in the areas of migration. So that is very interesting as well. So I think I have one final question, and it's I think everyone can answer this question. If you have any information about it, please share it in the chat box. We know how difficult it is to translate IPCC reports messages to general audiences. Do you have any resources or real life experiences explaining them in a way that led to concrete climate action by funders or non-climate stakeholders in broad terms? This is a very interesting question because that is something we also have identified. And the thing is, climate action, sometimes climate change issues, is very technical, and bringing it a lower, making it a more accessible, giving it a more accessible language to the whole impact community. It's one difficult task. So I would really like to know your answers, Johannes and Fabia, and if anyone else from our attendees has an answer, please, you're welcome.
Should I go first?
Yeah, you go, and then I jump in.
Well, it's not an easy question. I think what I first thought of is one organization. I don't know whether you know them. It's Climate Outreach, led by Alex Randall, and they're really focusing on this comms perspective on climate migration. They have a climate focus, but also working on migration. So this is a really great way and also resource for funders, I think, and a great sparring partner if you want to translate these technical messages to a wider audience. But of course, it's also always a struggle that we have in our communications department, like how to best sort that out. We started to work a lot with infographics on this topic to really explain the key messages. But yeah, that's like on a very practical term, maybe a recommendation. Maybe Johannes, you can go to, you can build on this.
Sure. Yeah, it is a very important question, and one that many people have. I would say that, of course, science has done a great service in bringing climate change up on the agenda, and the IPCC reports are a crucial part of this. We all know that 2 of the most recent reports have now been published. I'm not sure these are the 2 most important reports for funders, because there's other one coming out for focusing more on the solutions, I think in October. So that might be, I think, the one to look at. And there will be, as much as there was now on the first 2 reports, several webinars, for example, and then it always depends on what you would like to find out about these reports, who you go to. I know that, for example, the World Resources Institute has had very good webinars on the recent report. What I would like to draw attention back to is that exactly the message of intersections. The IPCC reports, they do present the most recent consensus in science on climate change and on different parts of climate change. But that's not always the most important thing for people on the ground. If for people on the ground, the most important thing might be the fact that they're having to migrate. It might be the fact that their kids can't go to school. It might be the fact that they're suffering from health issues and they can't get to a clinic. So in many of those cases, climate change is not the main concern of people on the ground, but the main concern is something else, and it's a co-benefit maybe of solving climate change, that also their situation will be bettered. So that's why I'm not sure that in all cases the IPCC reports are the first point of contact. I think they're very important for the wider debate, but if funders are looking to understand how they can make a difference in the issues that they've been working on for a long time, maybe talk to Fabia, the Bosch Stiftung first, if you want to learn about migration, then an author at the IPCC.
I would like as well to contribute. So when we started the Climate Action and Conservation platform, I didn't have too much background on climate action and conservation. So I hardly passed biology when I was in a school. So that was my level of understanding. So I started to, of course, educate myself, and I found talking with people and found really interesting resources, especially on issues that sound very technical, such as carbon voluntary markets, what is adaptation, what is mitigation, what is net zero. and how can financial innovation be drawn towards these issues. One of the most interesting is the one I'm sharing here. It's called Ecosystem Marketplace. It has very interesting reports, reviews that you can access quite easily. They're free. And I think they can be very helpful in your introductory journey towards understanding climate change and and conservation. So that's pretty much it. So I think we've reached the end of our session. Just a small reminder, we have our conference from the 24th to the 27th of 2022 in Cartagena, Colombia. Hope you join us. It's going to be very interesting. We're going to have a session on how nature-based solutions can be applicable for organizations along the continuum of capital. We're also going to have a discussion on how can we activate multi-stakeholder partnerships to integrate migrants in Latin America. Pretty much that's it. Thank you very much, Fabia. Thank you very much, Johannes. Thank you very much as well, Daniel, who is a spectator, for all your help, your support, your insights. And I hope we can carry out this this conversation. And hopefully those who assisted today can actually access the information that has been shared widely by Fabia and by Johannes. So thank you very much and have a nice day and afternoon as well.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.